Hello and welcome. My name is Bulid Mehr. I'm a Microsoft Technical Trainer here to walk through the Microsoft SC-300 Identity and Access Administrator Associate course with you. Think about the apps your organization relies on every day. Collaboration tools, business platforms, custom solutions. How do you make sure each app is secure, trusted, and seamlessly integrated with your identity environments? That's where app registration in Microsoft Entra comes in. In this session, you'll discover how registering app empowers you to control access, enable single sign-on, and manage permissions with precision. Get ready to unlock the gateway to secure, scalable, and efficient application management. So let's get started with app registration in Entra. And before we get started with app registration, something very important to remember is for you to be able to manage app in your Entra environment, you need to ensure that you have the right roles assigned to yourself. Now remember, we can't forget zero trust and have to remember the least privileged access that you require to be able to do your task. So just enough access for us is important at all times. In this case, when you're looking to manage applications, a couple of roles that come to mind from Entra ID, you must be aware of them. Two that are on the screen for you to look at, typically looking at an application administrator, a role that allows you to manage everything to do with applications in Entra environments. However, there is another role that we can talk about called the Cloud App Administrator. Now, I suppose the name gives it a little bit away. A Cloud Application Administrator is typically for someone who is going to manage all the aspects of applications, but just in the cloud. So they miss out on one key feature that we are going to look at a bit later in the session, talking about application proxy, typically used to manage applications that are based on-prem and you like to connect to them using your Entra ID. So your Cloud Application Administrator cannot manage that. However, if you want someone to be able to do that, you need to give them an application administrator role. So two very important roles to remember when you're managing applications in your environment. Now, let's talk about why is it important for us to integrate applications into Entra ID. When organizations add applications to Microsoft Entra ID, they unlock a powerful set of identity and access management features. By integrating apps with Entra ID, you can centralize how users can sign in and access resources, making things simpler and more secure. This integration supports a variety of scenarios, such as authenticating users, authorizing access to both apps and data, enabling single sign-on, and even automating user provisioning and synchronization. Whether your organization uses cloud apps, on-prem apps, or a mix of both, Entra ID acts as a central hub for managing who can access what and under what conditions. The benefit of this approach are significant. With Entra ID, you can enforce consistent security policies across all your applications, streamline user experience with single sign-on, and reduce administrative overhead by automating user management tasks. For example, when a new employee joins in, their access to necessary apps can be set automatically, and when they leave, it can be revoked just as easily. Entra ID also supports modern authorization protocols like OAuth, lets you extend your directory with custom attributes, and provide robust auditing and monitoring tools. In short, integrating your applications with Microsoft Entra ID not only boosts security, but also enhances productivity and compliance across your organization. When registering an application in Microsoft Entra ID, two key concepts help manage how applications interact with your organization: the application object and the service principal. Think of the application object as a blueprint or a master copy of your application. It defines how tokens are issued, what resources an app can access, and what actions it can perform. This object contains application's unique ID and it is registered in a home directory, serving as a global representation of your app. On the other hand, the service principal acts as the local instance of the app within a specific tenant. It references the application object and records local settings, such as users and group role assignments, permissions, and policies like conditional access. This separation allows organizations to manage app access and permissions in a flexible, tenant-specific way. The relationship between the application object and the service principal is crucial for both single-tenant and multi-tenant scenarios. A single-tenant app will have one service principal in its home tenant, while a multi-tenant can have the service principal in multi-tenant, created when a user from those tenants consent to use the app. This setup enables organizations to securely grant access to resources, assign roles, and enforce policy tailored to their needs. By leveraging application object and service principal, you gain fine-grained control over who can access your applications, what can they do, and how they interact with sensitive data, all while maintaining a clear, auditable structure for identity management. Now, just to explain some of that process and how that looks like when you're looking at registering or accessing an application from a tenant, let's have a look at the scenario that's presented on the screen. Now, first of all, just to explain what's going on, we have a tenant called tenant A that's listed down here, and we have an application that's over here within tenant A. So the home realm for the application is tenant A. That's where it lives. So the object ID and the service principal that this application would have would belong to tenant A. Now, in this scenario, we have a user that sits in tenant B, and this user is going to try and access this application. Now, it could be a scenario that we can recreate this application in tenant B and have another version of this application running, but we don't want that process to happen. We want to have the same instance of this application running in my environment and allow people from multiple tenants to be able to gain access to the same application. So in this case, the user from tenant B is going to try and gain access to this application. Now, for the very first time, when the user tries to gain access to this application, they're going to very likely try and reach the endpoint for this application by typing in, either going to a browser and typing it in, or opening some sort of API to gain access to the application. Now, when they try to gain access, one of the first things that they will see is your authorization endpoint, which is like your front door or front gate to check, hey, user, you're trying to come in. Can you tell me who you are? And request for a token before you can come in. So you must have a valid token to gain access to the application. As part of that, the user would be asked to authenticate themselves on who they are. And this is where the user can provide the authentication details. Once the user has been authenticated, they would then be asked to consent to the application. So if this application requires certain access or details from this user, the user should be able to consent. Now, we'll discuss consent a little bit later in the session to talk more about what other details come into play. Does this consent happen from the administrator? Can a user do it? So all sorts of different scenarios that we'll build into the session a bit later. For now, the user will be asked to consent to that. Once the user has consented to providing all the access to the application from the user, maybe it's picking up the user email address, user time, date, location. Once the user has consented to that, this simply will go back and allow the application to be granting access to the user. But before it does that, it simply creates a new service principal for this user, for this application in your tenant B. So the tenant B now has a service principal available for the user to gain access to this application. Even though the application's home realm is still the tenant A, however, in tenant B, it has a new service principal that's now available for the user to sign into. And the user receives a return token for them to be able to log in to this application. Now, a good question would be, who can register applications in my environment? And this is very, very interesting to understand, simply because if you are leaving your settings in your Entra ID as default, then by default, all users in your directories have the rights to be able to register these applications. Now, if you consider that as a security threat or an action that you don't want people to carry out, you must change these settings from the default. Now, if you think this is something that is normal for your organization, by all means, leave them as it is. However, you need to understand certain other aspects for it. For instance, they can't register an application, but when the application requires them to consent, does that consent happen by the user, or is it then going to prompt an administrator to approve? So again, some more details that we'll have to uncover when we start registering an application and start working with it. Now, before we go into start registering an application, let's first find out where these settings are, the default settings, where it prompts me to know that anyone in my organization can register an application. So let's jump into the portal, have a look at that, and then we'll start registering an application. All right, I'm back into my Entra portal, Entra Admin Center, using entra.microsoft.com. And when I look at my Entra Blade, all I'm going to do is look into my properties for my Entra. In fact, let's jump into the users and go into user settings from here. Now, as soon as I go into my user settings, again, you can see some of the default settings. This is something that we've covered in one of the previous sessions. If you haven't seen one of the videos before, please have a look at them when we speak about user settings and tenant-wide settings. And within the tenant-wide settings, you can see some of these settings. As default, this is enabled. So users can register an application in your tenant. Now, this is a default permission given to all the users. Now, if you think this is not something that you want to do, maybe you can look into changing this or bring in other policies that will help you control some of that later. So bear that in mind. So by default, this is enabled. Now, let's move away from looking at the tenant-wide settings in users, registering an application, and go into registering an application. Now I'm going to go back into my blades for my Entra Admin Center and look for app registration. Now in this part of the demo, I am going to show you how you register an application and take you through a few different parts of the process to understand what details that we need to provide and others that we can get away with. Now, let's have a quick look. First of all, I am going to click on New Registration, and this is where we can start giving a name to our application. Now, just for this demo, we'll come up with a name and give our application a name called Ask Contoso HR. And that's a name that I'm coming up with for my application today. Now, as I start registering my application, I'm asked to define a few things like, hey, who is going to access this application or API? Is it going to be just people that are within my tenant? Or am I looking for people from outside the tenant to be able to gain access to this as well? So you define these details. So is it a single tenant? Is it going to be a multi-tenanted solution? Or are you looking at people using their personal accounts as well? Things like their Xbox or Skype account? Or is it just for people that are using their personal accounts that are going to be logging into this? So you define out how you think you want to configure this application. For this demo, I'm going to leave this just to be accessible for my tenant that I'm working on right now, the Contoso tenant that we have. So we'll leave it just for that. Only this single tenant, and we'll move away from there. Now, apart from that, I do have some details further down over here that are optional. Again, if you're looking as a redirect URI for your application, you can add that in here if you wanted to, or you could amend this at a later stage as well. That's entirely up to you. Now, I could choose the details over here to suggest this is a web and provide it a redirect URI or URL. And I can start working with that. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to switch my screen for just 1 second. I have an app running in my Azure environment. Again, this is just a resource in my Azure. And currently, it's not linked to my Entra applications. So let's try and see if we can register this app in my Entra. So I'm going to bring the link or endpoint for that just right over here and start registering that. The protocol would be good. So if I can drop in HTTPS, that would work. Perfect. and we'll say register. Now, the start of the registration process is simple enough, just by adding a couple of details there, choosing what access I would like for this application, and I'm done with the registration part to start the process. Now, this has completed the registration process. To add more details, we have to go into the registration menu now to look through other things. Now, at a quick glance, a few things that we pointed out earlier already. So we have an application ID over here, and we have the object ID. So again, some of the details that we mentioned before, important to remember on what these are, just to make sure you know what you're looking at when you're working with the resources. Bear in mind those two items. All right. Now, apart from that, currently this app is registered. I can go and work with this in Entra. However, before I do, I could go into changing some of the settings for it. Things like, hey, we can add custom branding or branding and properties for this application. So for now, I've got the name ready, but I can amend that if I didn't write it properly, or if I want to call it something different, I can change that in here. I can upload a logo over here as well for this app, so it appears up in my portal, so I know what it looks like. Let's just bring a logo up from here. All right, so let's have a look at the logo from a random list of items that I have. So let's pick one of these and say open. And we have a new logo that we've uploaded. So now we know how our app looks like. Now we can give it a home URL. So that could be the same URL that we created before from the app itself. So HTTPS, and that's where the app will go. Now, if you had terms and conditions and privacy policies available to hand, by all means, they can go in some of these places. Just for this demo, I don't necessarily have a link for any of these policies, but if you had them, that would be good to drop them in there at this point. Now, apart from adding those details, what we can do is we can provide an internal note so that we know what this app is. We can create multiple instances of this app for different purposes. So just so that people know what this app is going to be, we can give them a little bit of an internal note to understand, hey, this is what we created this app for. So let's call this is the HR bot. And we can leave it as that. Cool. All right. Now, apart from that, we will move on to the next tab. So let's hit save on this so we can save the details about the applications that we've so far added, and we can move away from there. Now, apart from the branding and the properties, if we go into the authentication for a very quick look, if your application requires different details provided to it for when the token is returned to it, you can add other details in here. We'll leave the setting alone for today and we'll move forward. Along with that, we can also talk about certs and secrets. Now, if your application requires a direct application password to be added onto it, this would be the place where you would go and create that. In case your application doesn't like for you to have direct authentication using Entra, and you need for certain reasons a direct application password, this is where you can go and create one by simply going in to create a new client secret and going creating one. Now, it's preferred that you add a certificate to it and upload that, which probably would work better. But again, depending on your needs. For today, we'll leave that out as well. Now, apart from that, if I go further down, we have another option over here for token configuration. Now, within this part, if you require certain tokens to be, or claims to be captured from this application, or this application to capture from the user, this is where you will go and define them. For instance, if I click on add optional claims for a minute, I have options over here depending on the authentication method that you're choosing. For instance, if I do Open ID, I can see there are different claims I can add to this. So for instance, I might want to capture the user's email address, maybe their family name, and maybe some of the details that I might want to capture from them. So I can simply come in here and add these as additional claims for this authentication process. When it happens, it will capture this for me as well. Now, important part here to remember is it's nice to have these additional claims, but bear in mind, a lot of the time, most of your modern applications would like to reduce as much data in the traffic they can to make sure that this process happens much quickly and efficiently. So adding unnecessary claims might not necessarily be a good idea. But if it is needed for the application, for instance, as the user logs in and they are presented with a welcome screen with their name, maybe the local weather for them, so you need to get the local region where they are, maybe their name details, maybe that's all good. So make sure you can come in here and configure some of those details if they're already not part of the application. Now, apart from adding additional claims and looking at the token configuration, we can move into looking at API permissions. Now, this is where an application will prompt to the user saying, hey, user, I need you to consent that I would need these permissions from you to approve. So an app might be reading into different parts of from the user or from your setup where the user lives within your tenant. So this is where you can go into adding some of those details. For instance, let's have a look at an example. We have currently a user read permission that's already allocated in here. This is a delegated permission that's already enabled for the user. And again, this would allow the application to perform on behalf or act as on behalf of the user to request that information. Now, let me quickly go into add a permission, and let's see if we can add the permissions as an example. Let's go to Microsoft Graph. Now we have two set of permissions over here that we can create. One, delegated permissions, which would mean that the app would perform on behalf of the user to request or perform these tasks. And the second is the application permissions, which the application performs as if they're performing in the background themselves without pretending to be a user. So I have two different options there to look at. We can give an example of each one of them if you like. Go into delegate permissions, and over here we can say, all right, we might need, let's try this. Let's try right. Let's look at some calendar permissions and say, hey, we need to use, this application needs to read the calendar from the user. So let's add that permission. So now we have a calendar's read permission added onto this. All right, and if we add one more, just for understanding, let's go and add an application permission in here. Now, let's pick one from the list, and maybe let's try see. Right, again, just looking for another read permission that we can add to this user or for this application to use in the backend. Make it by all means, it doesn't have to be read. I'm just looking at one to pick up. And this is read calendars in all the mailboxes. So this is where we're adding another permissions to this. Right, cool. Now, in my example, I picked both the calendar read. They don't have to be calendar reads at all. But just to kind of explain the two different permissions I've added in here. One, delegated, where it will pretend to be acting as if the user signed in and doing this, so it inherits this user's permissions to be able to perform that. And the second is where the application, the backend, would be able to gain access on its own behalf to be able to perform that. Now, for some of these, let's hide the blade for a minute so we can see more details here. For some of these, it requires the admin to consent, so that it has some of these permissions where it requires a read more access in your environment. So it needs the administrator to confirm, yes, I'm okay for this application to be able to do this. Now, as an application administrator registering this app, I have the ability right now to go in here and say, hey, okay, cool. This is something that it requires an admin consent for. Do I go and grant the admin consent right here for this application right now? So I can do this. That means later on, this app or this particular part of the application would not require the user to request for one, or would not need the consent again because it's been approved. However, if you don't want that to approve at this level, and maybe you want to do this as one-on-one basis, maybe you can leave it off. And then when the user requests your access, they will then request the admin to approve that consent. Right, now, apart from looking at the API permissions, let's have a look at another part. We have something in here called app roles. Now, this is where you can start creating roles within the application. For instance, this app, within this app, I might have different people. So we are creating this app for people who are going to request or ask data from the HR. However, I also want some people to be able to maybe add data using the same application. So maybe we have analysts that are going to analyze data and just call out for data, and maybe they can add data to it as well, where we can create users that are just going to read data from this particular part of your environment. So they're not going to be writing data in here at all. So this is where we can start looking at changing some of those settings. So let's go into it and start giving them some of those roles. So let's create one. Let's call this as analyst. And let's say they have access to both. Allowed members can be the applications, users, or groups. And we can give this as task. Right. So they are able to write in the app. Okay. All right. And I want to enable that role. We'll apply that. Now we'll create another role just for the users. So let's call this end users. And again, this can be any. And let's give them a task for read, and call this can only read. Now obviously the description can be something more descriptive, where you define who is this role for, what they can do with it, so you know when you're assigning them later, you understand what they're for. So I'm just saying can read only. That's again me trying to explain that we have two different roles. So by all means, you can have many other roles depending on the need of your application. Maybe you have an admin staff that edits the data, you have or reads data and use data. Think of an example of a reception environment for an office where someone is booking meetings or looking at calendars to suggest bookings, and maybe someone in the back who then add notes to it to say, hey, during the meeting, this is what we did. So they can go and add data. Whereas the front desk admin staff might not need to do any editing to the data. So again, that could be an example that you can think of. In this case, our HR analysts can analyze data, edit data. End users can only claim for or request for reports. So that's the two roles that I'm creating in here. By all means, you can add more. Now, there is one more area where you can do this in. So adding roles can be done in a GUI interface like we just did using app roles, or I could have done this using the manifest. Now, if I go into the manifest environment very quickly, this is where you would do this in a JSON format. So we just added roles. You can see some of that information visible here for us to look at. So we just created a role called end user. That's visible for me here. And we created a role called analyst. So by all means, you could have done this in JSON. If you prefer doing scripting, by all means, come in here and edit that from there. Apart from that, we also have an area called the owner. Now, under the owner, this is where it becomes really, really interesting that I can now assign people to be an owner of an application. So they can come in here and manage everything to do with the application registration. So all the menus that we were going through, they can manage that for me. However, this is where we think of the least privilege access and the zero trust. I don't want to assign someone an application administrator or cloud app administrator role in Entra, but I still want them to be able to manage this app, just this app, this instance of this application. The easiest way around that would be to assign them as the owner of the application and they should be able to manage all aspects of just this application because they're the owner of the application. So it can lessen the load on your admins, and you can work with the least privileged access by not giving everyone an app admin role, because then that gives them a lot more privileges than just changing or managing some of these settings in here. So that could be a good way of looking at managing applications. Apart from that, finally, we'll have a last menu over here that says roles and admins. By default, we know that application administrator and cloud app administrators can manage applications. However, if you have other roles that you might want to assign that, hey, this role should be able to manage this application, this is where you can go and define some of those details in this point. So again, it's an option that you can look at, assigning different app roles or administrative roles on what they can do to manage within your environment for your applications. Now, with that, we have registered an application. So if I take a step back out again one more time to look at my app, registered app, and look at all applications, we should have our Ask HR app or Ask Contoso HR app ready for us to go. And it's visible for us to go back into if we ever need to go and change any registration settings. This is how it would do it. This concludes our session. We encourage you to review the reference modules, check your knowledge with the additional study materials, watch other videos in this course, or search out your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.